King of England is rotting alive. His legs, swollen to twice their normal size, ooze pus and blood through festering wounds that refuse to heal. The stench of his decaying flesh is so overwhelming that servants flee from his presence, abandoning the most powerful man in Europe to writhe in agony as his own body devours him from within. This grotesque, putrid creature was once Henry VIII, a towering figure of strength and charisma who had executed 2 wives and countless subjects. Now, the man who had wielded absolute power over millions finds himself utterly helpless against the most merciless executioner of all, his own rotting corpse. This isn't fiction. This was the horrifying reality of Henry VIII's final years, when the mighty monarch discovered that no crown could protect him from the democracy of decay. Welcome to the dark side of history, where we explore the terrifying truth behind one of England's most infamous monarchs. Today, we're diving deep into the gruesome details of Henry VIII's final descent into physical and mental hell. A story so disturbing, it makes his legendary cruelty seem almost merciful in comparison. To understand Henry's horrific end, we must first examine the man in his prime. In 1509, Henry VIII ascended to the throne as a golden prince, 6 feet tall, athletic, intelligent, and devastatingly handsome. He was the Renaissance king England had dreamed of, a stark contrast to his miserly father. But beneath this glittering exterior, the seeds of his destruction were already being planted. Henry's appetite for excess knew no bounds. He consumed massive quantities of rich foods, fine wines, and sweet delicacies. A typical meal for the king included multiple courses of roasted meats, elaborate pastries, and gallons of all. His daily caloric intake often exceeded 5,000 calories, more than double what a grown man needs. But it wasn't just food that Henry consumed voraciously. It was power, control, and the very lives of those around him. The first cracks in the armor. The transformation had begun, and it was hideous. By the 1520s, Henry's skull felt like it was splitting apart from the inside, his brain pounding against his skull with such violence that he would scream and claw at his head until his fingernails drew blood. Courtiers watched in horror as their once magnificent king would suddenly explode into murderous rage, his face contorting into something barely human as he hurled goblets, overturned tables, and threatened to execute anyone within reach. These weren't mere mood swings. They were glimpses into the psychological hell that was consuming the monarch from within. What had started as minor headaches was now a relentless assault by his own body, turning the man who controlled an empire into a prisoner of his own flesh. The courtiers who trembled before him no longer feared his power. They feared the unpredictable monster he was becoming. But it was a jousting accident in 1536 that truly marked the beginning of the end. During a tournament, Henry was thrown from his horse and lay unconscious for 2 hours. The impact was devastating, not just to his skull, but to his leg, which sustained a wound that would never properly heal. This wasn't just any wound. It was the beginning of a living nightmare that would consume the king's body from the inside out. The wound that became a portal to hell. The leg wound from Henry's jousting accident became the epicenter of his physical deterioration. What should have been a minor injury instead became a festering, putrid crater in his flesh. The wound refused to heal, constantly seeping a mixture of blood, pus, and other bodily fluids that stained his stockings and filled the air with the sickening sweet smell of rotting flesh. Court physicians were baffled. They tried everything, cauterizing the wound with red-hot irons, packing it with herbs, even inserting gold drainage tubes. Nothing worked. The infection spread like poison through his bloodstream, causing his leg to swell to monstrous proportions. Servants reported that the king's leg was so grotesquely enlarged that special accommodations had to be made for his clothing and furniture. The smell became so unbearable that Henry's presence could be detected from rooms away. Courtiers would hold perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces when forced to attend him. and many would excuse themselves to vomit after leaving his chambers. The man who once commanded absolute devotion now inspired nothing but disgust and horror. The mind's descent into darkness. As Henry's body rotted, his mind followed suit. The constant pain and humiliation of his physical condition drove him to new depths of paranoia and rage. He became convinced that everyone around him was plotting his death. Servants, physicians, even his own family members were viewed with suspicion. The king's fear of poisoning became all-consuming. He employed food tasters for every meal and flew into murderous rages when anyone suggested changes to his diet or medical treatment. His physicians lived in constant terror, knowing that a single misstep could result in their own execution. Several court doctors mysteriously disappeared or were found dead after failing to provide relief for the king's suffering. Henry's behavioral changes were dramatic and terrifying. The man who had once been known for his wit and charm now spent days screaming in agony, hurling objects at servants, and issuing death warrants for imagined slights. His paranoia extended to his food, his bedchamber, even the air he breathed. He became convinced that his enemies had found ways to poison him through his very environment. The isolation of absolute power. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of Henry's decline was his complete isolation. Absolute power, which he had wielded so ruthlessly throughout his reign, now became his prison. No one dared to tell the king the truth about his condition. No one could comfort him in his agony, and no one could challenge his increasingly erratic decisions. The very courtiers who had once competed for his favor now actively avoided his presence. His children were kept at a distance, both for their safety and because Henry could barely tolerate their healthy, young appearances as reminders of what he had lost. The king, who had demanded to be loved and feared, found himself alone, with nothing but his pain and paranoia for company. This isolation fed his mental deterioration. Without trusted advisors willing to speak honestly, Henry's grip on reality became increasingly tenuous. He would spend hours staring at his reflection, horrified by the bloated, putrid creature he had become, yet unable to accept the reality of his condition. Before we dive into the final, most horrifying details of Henry's death, it raises a chilling question. Was Henry suffering karma or just tragic coincidence? Drop your thoughts in the comments. The Final Descent. By January 1547, Henry VIII was no longer recognizable as the magnificent king who had once dazzled Europe. His body had become a grotesque parody of human form. His weight had ballooned to nearly 300 pounds. His face was so swollen that his eyes appeared as mere slits, and his legs were so infected that the smell of gangrene filled whatever room he occupied. The king's wound had become a gaping chasm that oozed constantly. Court records described the need for daily changes of bedding and clothing, all of which had to be burned due to the contamination. The infection had spread throughout his body, causing abscesses to form in multiple locations. Each new abscess brought fresh agony and added to the overwhelming stench that surrounded the dying monarch. Henry's final weeks were marked by delirium and terror. He would scream about assassins in his bedchamber, demand the execution of servants who displeased him, and rage against God himself for allowing his suffering. The man who had declared himself head of the Church of England now cursed the divine powers he claimed to represent. The ultimate lesson in mortality. Henry VIII's horrific death serves as perhaps history's most vivid reminder that no amount of power, wealth, or authority can shield us from the fundamental reality of human mortality. The man who had controlled the fate of millions, who had reshaped an entire religion to suit his desires, who had literally held the power of life and death over his subjects, was ultimately powerless against the rebellion of his own flesh. His absolute power, which had seemed to make him godlike, actually accelerated his downfall. The fear he had instilled in others meant that no one dared provide him with honest medical advice or challenge his destructive lifestyle choices. The isolation that came with supreme authority left him without genuine human connection in his darkest hours. The very throne that had elevated him above all other men became the gilded cage in which he suffered and died. The Inevitable Decay. On January 28, 1547, at approximately 2 a.m., Henry VIII finally succumbed to his suffering. But even in death, the horror wasn't over. Legend tells us that his body was so corrupted that it exploded during transport to his burial, painting the interior of his coffin with the putrid remains of what had once been the most powerful man in England. This gruesome end carries a profound truth that transcends the centuries. No matter how high we rise, how much power we accumulate, or how many lives we control, we are all equally vulnerable to the ultimate democracy of death. Our bodies, magnificent machines though they may be, are temporary vessels that will eventually betray us all. Henry VIII's reign teaches us that true power lies not in dominating others, but in accepting our own mortality with grace and dignity. The king who sought to be remembered as magnificent will instead be forever known for his monstrous end. A cautionary tale about the price of unchecked power and the inevitable triumph of nature over nurture, of mortality over monarchy. In the end, we are all equal in the face of death. Whether king or commoner, our flesh will fail us, our bodies will betray us, and we will return to the earth from which we came. Henry VIII's horrible death reminds us to live with humility, treat others with compassion, and remember that our time in these mortal forms is both precious and limited. If this dark journey through history's shadows has captivated you, please hit that like button to support our channel. Subscribe and ring the notification bell to join our community of history enthusiasts who aren't afraid to explore the darker truths of the past. Because sometimes, the most important lessons come from the most horrifying stories.